The midday sun blazed over the private airport, turning the courtyard into a stage of gleaming surfaces and sharp contrasts. The white jet shimmered under the harsh light, its polished exterior reflecting the sky in a dazzling brilliance. Men in tailored suits and polished leather shoes moved confidently about, their footsteps echoing sharply on the smooth concrete. Airline staff in crisp uniforms carried clipboards and murmured into radios, maintaining the order that such facilities demanded. The faint smell of jet fuel mixed with the tang of fresh polish on the hangar floor, giving the scene a pristine, almost sterile perfection. Into this carefully composed tableau walked a figure who seemed entirely out of place. A man whose presence struck the polished symmetry like a splash of mud on glass. He was thin, his frame wiry but hardened, his skin darkened and toughened by decades of labor beneath merciless suns. His cheeks were hollow, not from weakness, but from a lifetime of discipline, of days where work was done before food was eaten. His eyes were deep-set, carrying the weight of storms survived and harvests endured. His hands, cracked and calloused, bore the unmistakable signature of toil, years of gripping plow handles, pulling weeds, and lifting sacks heavier than many of the laughing men around him could ever imagine. He wore clothes that told their own tale. A shirt so faded that the original color was lost beneath patches of dirt and wear. The fabric was threadbare in places, torn at the elbows, stitched clumsily by hands that valued function over appearance. His trousers were frayed at the hems, the edges brushing against his old sandals, which had been resoled more times than anyone could count. On his head sat a straw hat, bent, warped, and darkened from long exposure to sun and rain. A weathered leather bag, its strap cracked with age, dangled from his shoulder. Every piece of him whispered of a life spent in fields, under skies that gave nothing without sweat. The contrast was jarring, and the men in suits noticed immediately. Their gazes turned toward him like iron filings pulled by a magnet. At first, there was only curiosity, but curiosity quickly morphed into derision. Smirks spread across well-fed faces. One or two men covered their mouths and whispered, though not quietly enough to hide their amusement. Chuckles rippled through the group like a contagious disease. To them he was a joke, a misplaced relic from a rural past, an unsightly blemish on their world of jets, wealth, and gleaming metal. The farmer walked with measured steps, each one steady but unhurried. He did not flinch at the whispers, nor did he alter his pace to escape their eyes. He had known such stares all his life. He had walked into banks where clerks mocked his sandals. He had stepped into markets where traders sneered at his patched clothes. He had learned early that society judged not by the honesty of a man's labor, but by the cut of his cloth. And yet he had never bent to their measure. Today, though, the stage was grander. The private hangar of a billionaire's world was not a place one expected to find a man like him. The irony was not lost on the onlookers. A group of young executives clustered near the gleaming jet leaned close, their whispers sharpened to insults. "What is he doing here?" one said with a laugh. "Must have wandered in from the fields." "Maybe he's here to polish the floors," another added. The group snickered, their polished shoes glinting as they shifted to get a better look. The farmer, whose name was Ragav Sharma, lowered his gaze, not in shame but in patience. His silence was not weakness. It was the quiet of a man who had outlasted storms, who had endured mockery so long that the sting had dulled into something meaningless. His face bore lines carved by time, and behind his calm eyes rested a truth none of them knew. For while the suits laughed, they had no idea that the man they mocked had built an empire from soil. For 70 years, Ragav had woken before dawn, his body rising with the crowing of roosters and the cool mist of morning air. He had bent his back in fields where others saw only wasteland. Where others abandoned land as barren and useless, he saw potential. Patiently, silently, he bought those lands. He nurtured them, tilled them, and coaxed life back into their parched veins. His hands, scarred and rough, had turned deserts into fields of gold. 1 acre became 10, 10 became 100, and soon his land stretched beyond what eyes could measure. His farms supplied grains, fruits, and vegetables not just to local markets, but to nations abroad. Ships left ports heavy with the harvests of fields no one else had believed in. And as his lands multiplied, so too did his wealth. Investments made carefully, quietly, blossomed over the decades until his fortune surpassed that of most men in the country. Yet none of that wealth showed in his clothes. He did not own golden watches or silk suits. He never traded his sandals for polished shoes. His joy came not from luxury cars or penthouse apartments, but from standing barefoot in soil damp with rain, from hearing the rustle of wheat bending in the wind, from teaching young farmers the methods that had saved him. His wealth had not corrupted his spirit. He remained a farmer, a man of earth, even as his bank accounts grew heavier than those who mocked him. And so, when he entered the hangar that day, he was not there by mistake. He was not lost. He was there because the jet that shone under the sun, the very aircraft these executives admired, belonged to him. It was his jet that stood gleaming like a jewel, his pilots waiting patiently for his arrival. But the crowd did not know. And so they laughed. From the far side of the hangar, a man in a navy suit approached, his stride confident, his grin wide. Deceive Malhotra, an ambitious manager known for climbing ladders by flattering the rich, saw only an old farmer out of place. He jabbed a finger at Ragav's chest and sneered. "Old man, this is a private facility. You don't belong here." Behind him, staff and executives chuckled openly now, emboldened by the manager's words. To them, this was sport entertainment to pass a dull afternoon. They did not see the calm in Ragav's eyes, the storms hidden behind decades of patience. And then, footsteps echoed from the other side of the hangar. Authority carried in that sound. The airport director appeared with two assistants, his voice steady and commanding as he spotted the scene. "Mr. Sharma," he said respectfully, inclining his head. "Your jet is ready. The pilots are waiting. Would you like us to arrange refreshments before your flight?" The words struck the air like a hammer on glass. The laughter died in an instant. Faces froze. Murmurs spread through the group like wildfire. The executive's eyes widened. Diffier's smirk vanished, his face draining of color. The women in uniform gasped, their polished confidence crumbling into shock. The man they had mocked was no beggar. He was no intruder. He was the owner. The jet, the hangar, the wealth, everything they admired was his. Ragav Sharma did not gloat. He did not spit back their insults or bask in their shame. He merely nodded politely to the director, his silence louder than any retort. With calm dignity he walked past the stunned group, each step deliberate, his head held high. The hangar fell into silence as Ragav walked forward. The polished shoes that had clicked so confidently on the concrete a moment ago now seemed rooted to the floor. Men who had smirked only seconds earlier suddenly found their throats dry, their carefully constructed masks of superiority cracking under the weight of truth. The director's words echoed in their minds, "Mr. Sharma, your jet is ready." The revelation was almost too heavy to grasp. For years they had been conditioned to equate wealth with appearances, luxury watches, imported suits, shining cars. Yet here stood a man who shattered that illusion with nothing more than his presence. His sandals were worn, his shirt patched, his bag weathered, but none of that mattered. He was wealthier than any of them could hope to be. Deceive Malhotra's hand, the same one that had jabbed mockingly at Ragav's chest, now trembled slightly as he pulled it back. The smug grin was gone, replaced by a stiff expression that betrayed his confusion and fear. He prided himself on knowing the rich, on networking with influence. How could he have been blind to the man who owned the very aircraft he had boasted about to others? Ragav passed him without a word. Silence was his armor. He had never needed to prove himself with arguments. The truth always revealed itself in time. And in this moment, truth stood taller than suits, louder than laughter. As Ragav moved toward the stairs of the jet, his steps deliberate and unhurried, memories began to rise unbidden from the depths of his mind. Each step reminded him of the countless days and nights that had led to this moment. The polished concrete beneath his sandals seemed to transform into the cracked earth of his fields, the hangar walls dissolving into horizons of golden crops. He remembered the first piece of land he had bought. A barren stretch of earth, dry and cracked, abandoned by those who believed nothing could grow there. Neighbors laughed when they saw him tilling that wasteland. "The old fool," they said, "he has thrown his money into dust." Traders mocked him at markets, declaring his crops would never sprout. Even his relatives urged him to give up, to find work elsewhere, to stop wasting his strength on hopeless soil. But Ragav had seen something they did not. He saw potential hidden beneath the cracks. He believed that with patience, water, and relentless effort, the land could breathe again. He rose before dawn each day, hauling water in buckets, spreading compost, tilling with hands blistered and bleeding. Days turned into months, months into years. And one morning, when the sun climbed over the horizon, he saw green shoots breaking through the dust. What others had called hopeless was now alive with promise. That small victory became his foundation. He bought more land, each piece dismissed by others as useless. Each time, the cycle repeated: ridicule, hard labor, quiet perseverance, and finally harvest. Over decades, those barren fields became an empire of crops that stretched beyond sight. Inside the hangar, Ragav's eyes lingered on the jet for a moment, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his wife who had sat by candlelight, sewing his clothes late into the night, refusing to let poverty rob them of dignity. He thought of his children walking to school barefoot because shoes were too expensive, their laughter still resilient despite hardship. He thought of the nights when the price of crops fell so low he nearly abandoned farming altogether, nights when despair gnawed at his spirit. Yet each time he had found the will to rise again, because he believed tomorrow's sun always held new hope. The executives whispered among themselves now, their earlier mockery dissolving into frantic speculation. Some tried to justify their laughter as ignorance, others shook their heads in disbelief. None dared to step forward. The sight of the director addressing Ragav with such respect had sealed their silence. They could no longer pretend he was invisible. The women in uniform who had chuckled earlier now stood with straightened backs, their faces flushed. They had been raised to value dignity, yet they had joined in the ridicule. Now they could not even meet Ragav's eyes as he walked past. Shame settled heavily upon them, like a weight they could not lift. Diffier Malhotra, however, was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. His pride was too sharp, his ego too inflated. He stepped forward again, though his voice was less steady this time. "Mr. Sharma, I had no idea. Please forgive my words earlier. I was merely following protocol." The lie clung weakly to the air. Everyone in the hangar knew the truth. He had mocked, not enforced rules. He had enjoyed belittling what he thought was weakness. Ragav stopped briefly and turned his gaze upon him. The farmer's eyes, dark and steady, carried the weight of 1,000 storms. Diffier faltered, his words trailing into silence. In that gaze he saw not anger, not vengeance, but something far heavier, disappointment. It was the look of a man who had endured ridicule all his life and no longer needed to respond. Silence was his verdict. Without a word, Ragav turned away and climbed the stairs to the jet. Each step was slow but firm, as if carved from stone. His straw hat tilted slightly under the afternoon sun, his worn shirt brushing against the gleaming metal railing, a symbol of two worlds colliding. Inside the jet, the hum of machinery greeted him, steady and familiar. The polished leather seats, the glass fixtures, the gleaming controls, all symbols of a life he had earned but never flaunted. He sat by the window, his posture straight, his face calm. As the engines began to stir, Ragav looked out at the runway, the vast stretch of concrete leading into open sky. Beyond that sky lay cities, nations, markets he supplied, but in his heart he saw only his fields. He could almost hear the rustle of crops in the wind, smell the damp earth after rain, feel the soil crumble between his fingers. The jet began to roll, and his thoughts wandered further back still, to the ridicule of neighbors, the taunts of traders, the disbelief of relatives. He remembered how, at times, those words cut deeper than hunger. Yet he had chosen not to fight with words but with results. And today the results spoke louder than any insult could. The aircraft accelerated, lifting from the ground. As the hangar grew smaller below, the people who had mocked him looked like scattered shadows, insignificant against the vastness of sky. Ragav closed his eyes briefly, whispering a prayer not of pride but of gratitude. Gratitude for strength, for patience, for the soil that had given him everything. For Ragav Sharma had never seen wealth as gold, nor riches as power. True wealth, he believed, was the strength to remain humble while the world misunderstood you, the courage to rise each time you were mocked, and the grace to forgive those who laughed at your struggle. The jet soared higher, piercing through clouds until the chaos of the ground was left behind. Inside the cabin, Ragav sat still, his hand resting on the armrest, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. From this height, the earth looked vast and endless, stitched together by rivers, valleys and farmlands. To many this view was a privilege of wealth. To Ragav, it was a reminder of every furrow he had plowed, every seed he had sown, and every dawn he had risen to greet with calloused hands. His mind drifted, pulling him back through the corridors of memory. He could still hear the laughter of neighbors when he first bought barren land. A fool's purchase, they had called it. Nothing will grow there. He wastes his life. But he had ignored them. While they slept, he tilled. While they mocked, he watered. He bent his back under scorching suns and freezing rains, determined to coax life from the earth. Slowly, stubbornly, the land yielded. And when the green shoots rose where only dust had been, the same neighbors who had mocked fell silent. That silence, Ragav knew, was more satisfying than any applause. For applause fades quickly, but silence born of disbelief carries weight. It was proof that he had defied the judgment of others. Yet even then he had never sought revenge. He did not buy land to boast, nor to crush those who ridiculed him. He bought land because he believed in its worth just as he believed in his own. The jet leveled above the clouds, and the hum of the engines became a steady rhythm. Ragav leaned back, closing his eyes. He remembered his wife, her hands rough from sewing late into the night, stitching patches onto his shirt so he would not go bare. He remembered the times when his children walked barefoot to school, their small feet blistered but their spirits unbroken. He remembered the harvests sold at prices so low he nearly abandoned farming, and the hunger that gnawed at him when meals were scarce. Each memory was a scar but also a badge of survival. They had shaped him into the man he was now, a man who knew that worth was never measured in fabric or polish, but in perseverance. Below him, in the hangar, the executives still stood stunned. Their laughter had died, replaced by murmurs that spread like wildfire. Some shook their heads, unable to believe what they had witnessed. Others whispered excuses to one another, desperate to rewrite their shame as misunderstanding. But deep inside, each one carried the sting of humiliation. They had mocked a man greater than themselves, and the memory would haunt them. Deceive Malhotra stood apart, his pride crushed under the weight of his own arrogance. The finger he had pointed now felt heavier than stone. His words, once so confident, now rang hollow in his ears. He had spent years chasing wealth, bending his back to flatter men in suits, desperate to rise in the corporate ladder. And yet, in one moment, he had revealed himself to be blind to true greatness. For greatness was not loud. It was quiet, patient, humble, and it stood before him in sandals and patched clothes. Inside the jet, Ragav whispered a prayer. Not for vengeance, not for pride, but for strength. Strength to remain the same man he had always been. Strength to continue giving even when mocked. For in his heart, he knew the truth. Riches could buy silence, but they could never buy respect. Respect had to be earned, and it was earned not by suits or jets, but by deeds. As the jet glided through the open skies, Ragav's thoughts settled into peace. He had lived long enough to see mockery turn into awe, ridicule into regret. Yet he carried no bitterness. His journey was proof that appearances deceive, but character endures. And in the quiet hum of the engines, he found comfort in knowing that while the world measured wealth in gold, his true treasure was humility. The jet cut smoothly through the sky, leaving behind a thin trail of vapor that stretched endlessly across the blue expanse. Inside, Ragav sat quietly by the window, his gaze locked on the horizon. The world below was reduced to patterns of green and brown, rivers weaving like silver threads, mountains casting shadows like folded cloth. It was beautiful, but for Ragav, beauty had always been rooted in the earth itself, in the sweat of labor, the resilience of seeds, and the stubborn growth of crops that refused to die. He thought of the countless mornings when he had risen before the world stirred. While others slept in comfort, he had stepped into the chill of dawn, his breath visible in the air, his hands gripping tools that seemed heavier with each passing year. The soil had been his companion, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous. It had tested his patience, mocked his effort, and yet, when cared for, it had yielded life. That bond between man and earth was something no wealth could replace. His fortune had grown quietly, almost invisibly. No one paid attention when a farmer bought a piece of neglected land. No one watched when he sowed seeds on soil others had abandoned. But when the crops came, when the harvests overflowed, the same people who had laughed now sought to bargain with him. Traders who once sneered at his torn shirt now begged for contracts. Banks that had refused him loans now lined up with offers. Yet through it all, Ragav never changed. His shirts remained patched, his sandals worn. He still walked among his fields, spoke with his workers, and gave away food to families who had nothing. For him, wealth was never measured by the size of his bank account. True wealth was the knowledge that children in villages went to school because he had built classrooms. It was seeing a widow smile because her pantry was full. It was knowing that when floods came and destroyed crops, he sent grain to families who would otherwise starve. His fortune was not in the gold others flaunted, it was in the gratitude of those he helped. Down below, in the airport hangar, the executives remained shaken. Their polished arrogance had been stripped away in a single moment. They had judged him by his clothes, by the worn hat on his head, by the sandals on his feet. And in doing so, they had revealed the poverty of their own character. Their wealth had made them blind. Ragav's silence, his refusal to retaliate, had pierced them more deeply than any words could. Deceive Malhotra sat apart from the others, replaying the moment again and again in his mind. His voice, once sharp with mockery, now sounded like poison in his ears. He thought himself powerful because he could humiliate those beneath him. But in a single glance from Ragav's calm eyes, He had felt small, smaller than he had ever imagined. The shame burned hotter than fire. Meanwhile, Ragav whispered another prayer. Not for the humiliation of those who mocked him, but for their enlightenment. He prayed they would learn that true worth lay not in clothes or titles but in deeds. For what use was wealth if it made one cruel? What use was power if it blinded one to kindness? As the jet climbed higher, Ragav's thoughts returned to his youth. He remembered the ridicule, the hunger, the despair that had once nearly broken him. But he also remembered the turning points, the moment his barren fields bloomed, the day his children returned from school smiling with books in hand, the first time he shipped his harvest abroad. Each victory had been quiet, unnoticed by the world, but deeply felt by him. He had never sought to teach others a lesson, yet life had a way of revealing truth. Today the truth was simple: appearances deceive but character reveals. The engines hummed steadily and Ragav closed his eyes. He saw his wife again, sewing by lantern light. He saw his children running barefoot, their laughter echoing in the fields. He saw the faces of the hungry villagers to whom he had given food. These were his treasures, more precious than the jet he now sat in, more enduring than any applause or recognition. Above the clouds he found peace. His wealth, his lands, his success, all of it was secondary to the humility that anchored him. He was still the same farmer who bent over fields, who wiped sweat from his brow, who whispered thanks for every drop of rain. The world could mock, the world could sneer, but the earth never lied. The earth rewarded those who gave themselves to it, and in that reward lay a richness no laughter could diminish. The story of Ragav Sharma was not about a poor man who became rich. It was about a man who remained humble, even when riches found him. It was about patience that outlived ridicule, dignity that outshone arrogance, and kindness that outlasted pride. And as the jet drifted through the endless blue, his legacy became clear: true wealth is not counted in coins but in character.